You know, there's a crash that almost nobody talks about. It happened at Orange County International Raceway sometime in 1973, and if you were standing in that crowd that day, you were watching what should have been one of the greatest qualifying runs in West Coast Pro Stock history turn into something else entirely. Bob Lambeck had just gone number one qualifier, at the track that was basically the center of the universe for Southern California drag racing in that era. Bill Jenkins was there. Dick Landy was there. Ronnie Sox was there. The entire pro stock world had shown up. And then the car crashed. And here's the detail that makes it different from just another racing accident. Lambeck had recently switched from a 4-speed transmission to a Lenco planetary setup. And the way you drove a 4-speed your whole career, you had your left foot working the clutch through every gear change. Every run, every pass, every qualifying attempt, left foot on the clutch. So when he made the switch to the Lenco, there's no clutch pedal after you leave the line. And he knew that. He'd trained himself. He actually tucked his left foot under the seat during runs, just to break the habit of reaching for something that wasn't there anymore. Except in the chaos of the crash, his foot was trapped. He broke his leg so badly he walked with a cane for years. And he never drove a pro stocker again. Now here's what gets me about that story. It's not just a tragedy. It's actually the perfect metaphor for everything Bob Lambeck's career represented. A guy who spent 3 decades being exactly right, doing exactly the right thing, making exactly the right adaptations, at exactly the wrong time, in exactly the wrong place, and somehow still never getting the credit that the record actually demands. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the racers who built American drag racing from the inside out without ever getting their name on a class or their face on a magazine cover. If you're someone who loves the real history of pro stock and super stock and the factory wars that shaped everything we think of as serious door slammer racing, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, here's the thing about drag racing history. It has a really specific memory problem. The sport remembers its landmarks and its personalities. It remembers Ronnie Sox because Sox had the charisma and the Sox and Martin brand and eventually got a class named after him at the U.S. Nationals. It remembers Bill Jenkins because Jenkins had the Grumpy's toy mythology and the technical genius reputation and the stories that got told and retold until they became legend. It remembers Dick Landy because Landy had the factory backing and the flamboyant personality and the nickname and the cars that showed up at every major event looking like they just rolled out of a Chrysler brochure. And those guys absolutely deserve to be remembered. Their records are real. Their contributions to the sport are real. But here's what most people don't realize. The sport was also built by a whole category of racer who doesn't get the retrospective. Guys who won the most points in any class in any division in an entire year of national competition and barely show up in the general history. Guys who were in the field at the very first running of a new class that would define professional drag racing for the next 5 decades and don't get mentioned in the founding mythology. Guys who fielded the car that ended Bob Glidden's 9-event winning streak and set the national elapsed time record and still don't have a Wikipedia page. Bob Lambeck is the most complete version of that story I have ever found. And to understand why it matters, you have to start not with the crash at Orange County, but with Belleville, Michigan in 1941, and a kid who grew up 20 miles southwest of Detroit breathing the internal combustion religion that the auto industry had made into the local culture. Because the trajectory from there to Northridge, California, to the founding of Pro Stock, to that qualifying run at Orange County, to the Hemi Barracuda that won 4 national event classes back-to-back across 1976 and 1977, that trajectory is basically the entire arc of American drag racing's professionalization in one career. And most of you have never heard of him. Bob Lambeck was born in January of 1941. He relocated to Southern California and set up in the San Fernando Valley, eventually landing at 8810 Yolanda Avenue in Northridge, where Bob Lambeck Enterprises became one of the more respected engine-building operations on the West Coast. His first national result worth noting came at the 1963 NHRA Winternationals at Pomona, where he won his class in a 1962 Pontiac Stalker. That's 7 full years before Pro Stock even existed as a class. He was doing handicap-based stock racing while the sport was still figuring out what it wanted to be. And he kept doing it through the mid-60s, winning regularly on the Division 7 circuit covering California, Nevada, and the surrounding state. The real breakthrough on paper came in 1967 when he won the NHRA Division 7 G-Stock Championship in a 4-speed 1957 Chevrolet. If you're not deep in NHRA class nomenclature, G-Stock was a weight-per-cubic-inch based class that put him against other production-based cars in a similar displacement range. Winning the division title meant you were consistently the best in your class across multiple regional events throughout the year. Not a one-day fluke at a national. A sustained campaign. And at the 1967 World Finals in Tulsa, Oklahoma, he ran well enough that a Chrysler Racing Program representative named Jerry Gross took notice. That conversation changed everything. Now, you might be thinking, okay, a division championship in G-Stock in 1967, that's solid but it's not exactly groundbreaking. And you'd be right if that's where the story stopped. But here's where it gets really interesting, because right around the same time Lambeck was winning his division title, something much bigger was happening inside the sport itself. Something that would create the conditions for everything that came after. NHRA Super Stock racing in the mid-60s ran on a handicap system based on weight-to-power ratios, which meant you weren't necessarily racing the car next to you heads up. You were racing your dial-in against the other car's dial-in. And theoretically, the best combination of car and driver would win. But in practice, it was inconsistent and confusing for fans. And honestly not that satisfying for the top drivers either, who knew they were faster than their competition but couldn't always prove it in a straight heads-up run. The match race circuit was where the real money was. Factory-backed drivers like Ronnie Sox, Dick Landy, Bill Jenkins, and Don Nicholson were earning $1,000 or more per appearance, just showing up at regional strips and doing 2 or 3 runs against whoever the local hero was. The fans loved it because it was simple. Heads-up racing between known names in recognizable cars. The factory teams were essentially running a shadow professional circuit, while NHRA was still doing things the old way. And then Chrysler did something that shifted the entire landscape. What Chrysler unleashed on the Super Stock world in 1968 was one of the most dominant factory racing programs in drag racing history. The story starts in November of 1967, when Chrysler engineer Bob Tarazzi began designing what would become the BO-29 Plymouth Barracuda and LO-23 Dodge Dart Super Stock program. Chrysler contracted with Hurst Performance up in Ferndale, Michigan, to take partially assembled A-body darts and Barracudas off the line and convert them into dedicated race cars. And when I say dedicated, I mean it in the most complete sense. Fiberglass hood, trunk lid, and fenders. Kemker ultra-thin glass to save weight. Boston Ram A100 van seats, which were lighter than anything Chrysler put in a production car. Interior stripped to nothing. And under the hood, a 426 race Hemi with a cross-ram aluminum intake, dual 735 CFM Holley 4 barrels and headers, and a Dana 60 rear end with 4.86 gears. The cars were officially rated at 425 horsepower, which was so far from reality it was almost funny. These things made well over 600 horsepower once properly set up, and they ran in the 10.3 range right out of the box. To put that in context, the best Ford 428 Cobra Jet cars were running about an 11.5 in SS/E. A full second slower. Nothing came close to a Hemi A-body in 1968, and Chrysler knew it, and the competitors knew it, and the rulebook just hadn't caught up yet. About 80 LO-23 darts were built. Somewhere between 50 and 70 BO-29 Barracudas, depending on which source you trust. They went to Chrysler's top factory drivers and selected team members. Ronnie Sox got one. The Sox and Martin Barracuda became probably the most famous of the bunch, though it went through several configurations over the years. Dick Landy got two LO-23 darts, one automatic, one 4-speed. Don Grathier got a BO-29. Herb McCandless got a dart. Arlen Vank, Billy Stepp, Bob Reed, whose Barracuda still exists and has been restored. These were purpose-built race weapons distributed strategically to racers who could put them in the winner's circle and generate the kind of exposure the factory program needed. So back to Lambeck and Jerry Gross. By 1968, Gross had facilitated a partnership between Lambeck and Dick Landy. And this is where things get interesting because Lambeck isn't driving his own car anymore. He's driving Landy's equipment. Landy at his peak was managing up to 7 race cars in a single season across multiple drivers and multiple classes, and he needed someone he could trust to go win in the cars he wasn't personally piloting. Lambeck became his primary team driver. At the 1968 NHRA Winternationals, Lambeck was still in his 57 Chevy winning class, including defeating Frank Iaconio, who would later become a notable Pro Stock competitor himself. But the real campaign that year was with Landy's 440-powered Dodge Dart GTS in SSCA, which stood for Super Stock E-Class Automatic. And there was a piece of technology in that car that became part of Lambeck's story in a genuinely interesting way. The B&M high-stall torque converter setup allowed the engine to build more RPM before the converter locked up, which effectively let the car launch harder without breaking traction. It worked well enough that B&M used Lambeck in an advertisement in the October 1969 issue of Super Stock and Drag Illustrated, promoting the product. That tells you something about how well regarded he was within the Mopar racing community even at that early stage. He won the 1968 NHRA Division 7 Super Stock Championship. More than that, NHRA noted he had accumulated more points than any other champion in any class in any division that year. Let that sit for a second. More points than any other champion in any class in any division. That is a remarkable qualifier that gets almost no attention in the histories. In a sport that was transitioning rapidly from regional to national competition, being the highest point champion anywhere in the country was a genuine achievement. One that almost nobody today could tell you about. And then 1969 was more of the same, only bigger. Lambeck won the Division 7 Super Stock Championship again, this time driving Landy's SSCA 1969 Dodge Super B. And at the Winternationals that year, he won his class outright with a run of 11.48 at 106.88. He finished the season as national runner-up in Super Stock, losing to Ed Terry's Ford Cobra Jet by 100 points. 100 points in an NHRA point season is not much. He was right there. Here's the thing about 1969 that explains why everything that came next was almost inevitable. The top factory drivers who'd been doing the match race circuit for years knew that heads-up professional door slammer racing was what the sport needed, and NHRA's own rulebook didn't have a place for it yet. The United Drag Racers Association had already created a professional heads-up division in 1967. The HRA was doing it at their events, and NHRA founder Wally Parks had publicly said he would never create a heads-up stock class, calling it in a Motor Trend interview that October something so out of touch with what was actually being produced. But then at the 1969 NHRA Nationals in Indianapolis, the confrontation happened directly. Sox, Landy, Jenkins, and Nicholson went to Parks and basically laid it out. Create a heads-up professional class, or we go to HRA and take your whole top super stock program with us. Parks had just watched Jim Tice over at NHRA offering exclusive deals to his biggest stars. The leverage was real, and Parks knew it. On October 31, 1969, NHRA announced Pro Stock in the pages of National Dragster. The class that Parks had sworn would never exist was going to run at the 1970 Winternationals. And Lambeck was right in the middle of this moment. He was Landy's team driver. And Landy was one of the 4 guys who effectively forced the creation of Pro Stock. So when the 1970 Winternationals rolled around at Pomona, Lambeck was in the field. Now here's a story that doesn't show up much in the standard histories, but it says something important about how the factory team dynamics actually work. Landy set Lambeck up with a clutch-flight automatic transmission for the Pro Stock debut. Lambeck was a proven 4-speed driver. He'd been shifting gears at national events for years. But Landy apparently thought the automatic was the safer choice for a new class with a new car. As Lambeck later described it, the clutch flight was a piece of junk. He couldn't make it work. And after that first race, Landy told him to take it out and throw it away, and he'd give him a 4-speed. That's a small detail, but it tells you something critical about the factory team relationship. Lambeck wasn't calling his own shots at that point. He was running Landy's equipment Landy's way, and then adapting when it didn't work. What it also tells you is that even at Pro Stock's very beginning, the teams were still working through basic setup questions that seem obvious in hindsight. The class was brand new. Nobody had a perfect answer for anything. What Lambeck did next, though, is the part that genuinely deserves more attention than it gets. He won the 1970 NHRA Division 6 Pro Stock Championship driving a Dart, and simultaneously won the 1970 Division 7 Super Stock Championship. He was competing in 2 major classes at the same time and winning both of them at the divisional level in the inaugural year of Pro Stock. 2 divisional championships across 2 different classes in year 1. That is the bridge in action. He was winning in the new class while still dominating in the old one. And then Chrysler cut the factory racing budget. The manufacturer wars that had been funding the top factory teams through the late 60s started winding down. By the end of 1970, the money flow changed significantly, and Lambeck was out on his own. What he did next says a lot about how resourceful a working racer had to be in that environment. He tracked down a 1968 Super Stock Hemi Dodge Dart that had ended up in Oklahoma. The engine had been built by Don Grathier, who had won the 1969 Winternationals Super Stock class in his own BO-29 Barracuda. So the provenance on this motor was legitimate. He bought the whole car for $2,200, $2,200 for a race-winning Hemi Dart with a top-tier engine. That gives you some sense of what the market for purpose-built super stock cars looked like when the factories backed out. He brought the car to chassis builder Ron Butler, who worked out of the Los Angeles area and whose shop was doing serious work on Mopar Pro Stockers at the time. Butler also built cars for Butch Leal and Bill Bagshaw, so he understood what these things needed. The combination worked. And Lambeck was winning West Coast Pro Stock events through 1971 without factory backing and without the big team infrastructure that Jenkins and Sox were running on the East Coast. By 1972, Butler built him a Plymouth Duster Pro Stocker, and he was now competing against what was rapidly becoming the most competitive class in drag racing. The weight problem for Mopar racers specifically was brutal. NHRA's weight rules for Pro Stock put Hemi-powered Chrysler products at a significant disadvantage versus the small-block Chevys and the Boss Ford motors. We're talking 200-plus pounds in some cases. 200 extra pounds in a drag car is not a slight disadvantage. It's a fundamental handicap that no amount of tuning fully overcomes. And yet Lambeck was consistently running with the best of them. Which brings us back to the Lenko decision. The Lenko decision came out of a race at Bakersfield against Larry Huff, who had already made the switch. Lambeck watched Huff gain half a car length per shift. Just repeatably, consistently, every single pass, half a car length every time he hit a gear. And a Lenko planetary transmission works by pre-selecting gears through levers rather than engaging a clutch each time, which when properly set up is faster and more consistent than a conventional 4-speed. Lambeck had resisted making the change partly because he was a 4-speed guy who knew how to drive that equipment, and partly because any change in a race car is a variable that can go wrong. But after watching Huff's runs, he ordered a Lenco the next day. His first outing with the Lenco was at Fremont. He qualified number 1. The adaptation worked. And then came the first real competitive event with the new setup at Orange County International Raceway. And that's where we started. The crash that ended his pro stock driving career. He was the top qualifier that day. Jenkins, Landy, Sox were all in attendance. The entire pro stock elite watched it happen. And he never drove a pro stocker again. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so the story ends there. A career cut short by injury. A racer who never got to see how far the Lenco setup might have taken him at the national level. And that's a legitimate way to read it. But here's what most people don't realize. The crash at Orange County wasn't the end of Bob Lambeck's impact on the sport. In some ways, the most important chapter hadn't even started yet. Because what he did next, the pivot from driver to engine builder and car owner, that's where the record gets genuinely remarkable. He was building serious championship-winning machinery for other people while Chrysler was figuring out how to stay connected to drag racing without officially sponsoring teams. The mechanism for that reconnection was Direct Connection, Chrysler's factory performance parts catalog. And Lambeck became one of its flagship examples. But before we get to the Hemi Barracuda and what it won, there's a chapter that connects everything together, and it involves a yellow Plymouth Duster and a driver named Tim Ekstrand. Chrysler approached Lambeck in the mid-70s about getting back into stock class competition with direct connection parts. They wanted wins, and they wanted them in cars running their components. Lambeck built Ekstrand a yellow Duster with a low-compression 360 cubic inch engine set up for stock eliminator. And Ekstrand won the 1975 NHRA World Finals and became the 1975 NHRA Stock Eliminator World Champion. That's the first World Championship for a Lambeck car. He then built an identical red one for Ekstrand and kept the yellow one for himself. And simultaneously, he was campaigning the Hemi Barracuda. Now, I want to be straight with you here about what we know and what we don't, because intellectual honesty matters more than a clean narrative. Every available source confirms that Lambeck raced a Hemi-powered Plymouth Barracuda in the A-modified production class and the SSDA class. And he won class at the 1976 and 1977 NHRA Winternationals and the 1976 and 1977 NHRA US Nationals. 4 major national event class wins in 2 consecutive years with this car. Chrysler's Direct Connection program featured the car in advertisements in 1977, which tells you it was considered a flagship example of what their performance parts could do in competition. What I could not pin down definitively is the specific model year of the Barracuda. The documentary sources call it a Hemi Barracuda, but none of them specify 1968. And that distinction matters because a 1968 A-body Barracuda is a fundamentally different animal from a 1970 or 1971 E-body Cuda, in terms of platform size and how it would have been classed. The SSDA designation, suggesting a Hemi with automatic transmission, also points in potentially different directions depending on the year. The most historically interesting possibility is that this was one of the original BO-29 factory Super Stock Barracudas from 1968. There were somewhere between 50 and 70 of those cars built, and by the mid-70s many of them had moved through multiple owners as the racing landscape changed. The factory program was long over. Chrysler had backed out of motorsports. These cars were out in the world with various racers. And it's entirely plausible that Lambeck acquired one through his deep network of Mopar connections and ran it in modified production and super stock. But I can't confirm it. No VIN shows up in the sources I found. No period feature specifically identifying the car's origin. If anyone watching this has documentation on Lambeck's Barracuda, specifically its model year and provenance, that fills in a real gap in the historical record, and I genuinely want to know about it. Look, here's what we do know, and it's significant regardless of which specific Barracuda this was. The A-modified production class in 1976 and 1977 was a legitimate national-level competition program. Modified production had been around since the early 60s, and it essentially allowed production-bodied cars with non-stock engine configurations. In the years right after Pro Stock launched, modified production became a kind of clearinghouse for serious racers who either couldn't afford the top Pro Stock program or were competing cars that didn't fit Pro Stock parameters. Running a Hemi Barracuda in AMP with a direct connection spec engine setup was exactly that kind of program. And winning class at Pomona and Indianapolis back-to-back across 2 seasons is not a footnote. That's a documented competitive record at the 2 most important events on the NHRA calendar. The direct connection advertisement placement is worth lingering on for a moment because it tells you something about Chrysler's strategy in that period. The factory had officially backed out of motorsports in 1971 as part of the Automobile Manufacturers Association motorsports withdrawal, along with Ford and GM. But direct connection was how Chrysler stayed connected to drag racing without officially sponsoring teams. They sold the parts you needed to go racing and then pointed to the racers who were winning with those parts. Lambeck's Barracuda winning 4 national event class wins was exactly the result they wanted in their advertising. He wasn't a paid factory driver anymore, but the relationship was still very much alive. This is where it gets really interesting because through the late 70s, Lambeck was also working with driver Randy Humphrey on a program that would produce arguably the single most dramatic moment of his entire career. And this moment involves a number that every serious drag racing fan knows. 9 consecutive national event wins. That's what Bob Glidden had put together by the summer of 1979. 9 in a row. 17 straight final rounds. Glidden was on the most dominant run in Pro Stock history, and the whole sport was watching to see if anyone could stop it. Lambeck and Humphrey had put together a 1978 Plymouth Volare Pro Stocker powered by a Gen 2 426 Hemi and worked it onto the National Pro Stock circuit. At the NHRA Mile High Nationals in Denver, Colorado, with the thin air that changes everything about how a naturally aspirated engine performs, Glidden met Randy Humphrey in the semifinal. Glidden red-lighted. Humphrey went to the final. He beat Sonny Brymer with a 9.27 to a 9.31. And the streak was over. The most dominant run in Pro Stock history ended in a Lambeck car. Earlier that same season, the Humphrey-Lambeck Volare had set the national elapsed time record with an 8.46 at Fremont, improving on Glidden's own 8.48 from the Gator Nationals, the last Hemi-powered car to hold the National Pro Stock elapsed time record. The last Gen 2 Hemi-powered car to win an NHRA Pro Stock national event. That distinction held for more than 2 decades. Now, you might be thinking, why don't I already know this story? And the honest answer connects back to something I said at the very beginning. The sport has a memory problem. It remembers the personalities that made for great copy. Glidden's streak is a famous story. The car that ended it is considerably less famous. The engine builder behind that car even less so. But the record is there. It's documented. It happened. And it happened because of decades of accumulated knowledge about how to make a Hemi work inside a race car, knowledge that started in a G-Stock 1957 Chevy in 1967 and ran all the way through to a Denver Strip in 1979, where a streak died. Lambeck kept racing and winning into the 80s. He won the 1983 NHRA International Stock Eliminator title driving himself. He took the ISA class at both the 1984 and 1985 U.S. Nationals in a small block Plymouth Duster. And Tim Ekstrand won a second Stock Eliminator World Championship in 1985 in a Lambeck car, giving him 2 World Championship car owner titles across a decade. 2 World Championships as a car owner. 2 divisional titles in Pro Stock's inaugural year. 4 national event class wins with the Hemi Barracuda. The car that ended Glidden's streak. The national ET record with a Hemi engine. and the most points accumulated by any champion in any class in any division in 1968. That's the record. Written out plainly, it's remarkable. And most of you had never heard his name before this video. Here's what I think the Lambeck story is actually about. His career from 1963 to the mid-80s traces almost exactly the arc of American drag racing's professionalization. He was a G-Stock champion when that's what the top competitors did. He was a Super Stock champion when the factory wars were at their absolute peak. He was a Pro Stock driver in the inaugural season of the class that would define professional door slamming for the next 50 years. He won in modified production with a Hemi Barracuda when that class was the competitive afterlife for the cars and technology that had defined the golden age. And he fielded championship cars and engines through the decade that followed. The problem with being a bridge is that bridges don't usually get named after anyone. The landmarks on either side do. Ronnie Sox got the magazine covers and the career retrospectives and eventually a class named after him at the U.S. Nationals. Jenkins got the Grumpy's Toy Mythology and the endless technical deep dive. Landy had the factory backing and the flamboyant personality and the nickname and the documentaries. Lambeck was the guy who won more points than any other champion in any division in 1968 and barely shows up in the general history. That pattern is common in motorsports and in most competitive fields, honestly. The pioneers and the flamboyant personalities get remembered. The deeply skilled working competitors who show up every week and win consistently and adapt to every rule change and every new class and build engines for other champions and field cars for world title campaigns, those people do not get remembered at the same rate. And I think that's a genuine loss for how we understand the sport. Because what Lambeck represents isn't just an overlooked individual career. He represents an entire category of racer whose contributions are embedded in the results and records without ever being front and center in the stories we tell. The engine builder whose work shows up in somebody else's winner's circle photo. The car owner whose name is in the small print of the trophy entry. The driver who was winning divisional championships while the people who'd get famous were the ones getting the factory trucks and the magazine shooters. His son Doug went on to become one of the most accomplished NHRA comp, eliminator and stock racers in the country, accumulating 16 career national event wins as of 2020. His grandson Austin represents a third generation. The family is still in drag racing today. The engine-building legacy that started at 8810 Yolanda Avenue in Northridge continues. Bob Lambeck died on April 25, 2025, at the age of 84. NHRA's official obituary called him a Southern California door slammer legend, a pro stock pioneer, a multi-time divisional champion, and a two-time world championship car owner. All of that is true. It is also, if you've been paying attention through this whole story, somewhat understated relative to the full picture. The Hemi Barracuda that he ran at the Winternationals and the U.S. Nationals back-to-back across 1976 and 1977 is the physical embodiment of that transition moment. By then, Pro Stock had moved well past the Hemi engine. The big-dollar operations were running purpose-built tube-frame cars with specialized motors and full sponsor backing. But here was Lambeck running a Hemi-powered production-bodied car in modified production, winning national events and appearing in factory advertisements as proof that the technology still worked. He was simultaneously a relic of the golden age and a working professional competing at the highest available level of his chosen class. Whether that specific car was an original 1968 BO29 factory Super Stock car or a later Barracuda built up to similar specs, I cannot tell you for certain based on the documentation I found. What I can tell you is that the combination of the car, the driver, the engine program, and the direct connection partnership placed it in a lineage that runs directly from the 1968 factory wars through the founding of Pro Stock, through the independent years, through the era of Glidden's dominance, and into the period when corporatized motorsports started to change everything about who got funded and who got remembered. That Barracuda is sitting somewhere right now. Maybe in a collection. Maybe in a garage. Maybe at a show where people walk past it not knowing what it represents. If it's an original BO-29 car, it came from a program that produced fewer than 70 of them, and most that survive are known and documented. If it's a later build, it has its own history worth tracing. Either way, the car and the career behind it represent a piece of drag racing history that hasn't been fully told. And it probably deserves to be, before the people who remember it firsthand are all gone. 3 generations of Lambeck racers and counting. The engine-building business ran for decades. The cars he built won world championship. The cars he drove won national event. The car he fielded ended the greatest winning streak in Pro Stock history. And at the very beginning of Pro Stock, in that field at Pomona in 1970, he was there driving Landy's equipment, trying to figure out a clutch flight that didn't work, standing in the same starting line as every other pioneer who gets considerably more credit for simply being there. That's the story. The overlooked ones usually have more of it than the obvious ones. This is one of those cases. And if you're going to understand Pro Stock and Super Stock and the factory wars that built this sport from the ground up, you cannot do it honestly without understanding the racers who made it work from the inside, without the magazine covers, without the factory trucks, without the documentaries. You need to know Bob Lambeck.